Hello, welcome to Entre Redes RI, where soccer meets international relations. My name is Pamela,
And my name is Elena. We are the translators of this episode.
and today we arrive at the first episode where we will dive into a theme that spins global story, colonialism and post-colonialism. Have you ever stopped to think that soccer was a product of colonialism, that it was introduced in many cultures as part of a project of cultural domination, but later became a space for resistance and national pride? To discuss this with me, today we have a very special guest who will share her thoughts and bring other perspectives to the conversation. Welcome, Avila. She's bachelor degree in Portuguese Language and Literature, Federal University of Maranhão, master degree in Literature, Culture and Frontiers of Knowledge, Federal University of Maranhão, Research Racism, Blackness, Culture and Contemporary Literature.
Thanks, Alessandra. It's a pleasure to be here. This theme is fascinating because it connects theory and practice, the history of colonization, post-colonialism criticism, and how soccer ends up being a reflection of all of this. I'm sure that we have a rich chat today.
Block 1: Colonialism, Expansion, and Cultural Imposition. First of all, it's important to define what colonialism is. We are talking about the process of European expansion, mainly between the 15th and 20th centuries, which involved political domination, economic exploitation, and cultural imposition. In other words, it was not just a matter of occupying territories, but also of shaping identities, language, belief, and even social products such as sport.
Exactly. Colonialism created artificial borders, destructured local societies, and forced European lifestyle on several populations. And soccer gets exactly in this context. The colonizers saw this sport as a way to civilize native peoples, to instill discipline, and even reinforce racial hierarchies.
Table of examples. Our first example is Algeria under French rule. Football was initially restricted to settlers and elite clubs, but soon the Algerians took ownership of the game, forming their own teams and turning football into a tool of resistance. The most emblematic case is that of FLN team linked to the National Liberation Front, which uses football as political propaganda during the war independence. Our second example is South Africa during the apartheid era. Soccer was completely segregated. There were white clubs and black clubs with separate competitions, but the sport also ended up became a space for protest, especially in the 1970s and 1980s, when black players began to gain international recognition, even in the face of oppression by the regime. How can we not mention our country, the famous country of soccer, which also shows colonial influences? Soccer arrived through the elite inspired by English models. For a long time, black and mixed race peoples were excluded from clubs. Only later, with players such as Arthur Friedrich and then Leonidas da Silva, that Brazilian soccer began to become a space for inclusion, but always amid racial tensions. Block 2: Post-colonialism, Theory and Resistance. Move on to post-colonialism. We can define this field of thought as a critic of the legacies of colonialism, both political and cultural. Authors such Edward C. Ombahab, Gayatri Spivak, and Franz Fanon show how Eurocentrism continues to influence the way we understand the world. Post-colonialism also denounce silent voice, the subalterns, and show how former colonies try to construct our narratives, resisting the symbolic domination of the former metropolis.
And football is really important in the debate. Think, for example, of the African national teams in the World Cup in the 70s and 80s, when there, Cameroon, Nigeria, and Senegal entered the field. That not only was sport, it was a political act, an affirmation of national identity in front of the former colonial powers. And there is more. A lot of players of former colonies migrated to the metropolis. This created identity tensions. As a classic example, its France national team, which since the 90s had been formed by players of African and Arab descent. The World Cup of 1998, when France won with Zidane, Thuram, Zaya, and many others, was celebrated as the victory of France blank burn, which means like black, white, and Arabic. Well, but at the same time, this generated debates about integration, racism, and social exclusion.
That's right, Avila. Very good point. It is worth remembering Franz Fanon think in his work, The Wood of the Worth. The colonialism not only exploits, but also internalized an inferiority complex in the colonized. Soccer, in this case, can be seen as a stage where this inferiority is challenged. When Cameroon beat Argentina in 1990, or when Senegal eliminated France in 2002, there was a very strong symbolic message. Former colonies can overcome the metropolises. Block 3. Soccer colonialism in today's geopolitics. There is a very strong dimension to the post-colonialist debate that needs to be remembered. The idea of players being sold, not just in the sense of normal market transfers, but in the exploitation of young athletes, mainly for Africa and Latin America. European clubs often send scouts to poor countries, identify talented teenagers and bring them to the Europe with promise of health and success. But the reality is that many of these boys are discarded, abandoned, and left without a life structure. This process has been called by some scholars sports neocolonialism because it repeats the logic of the health structure for the colonial period. Only now the health is not mineral or agricultural, but human.
That's right. A lot of boys are literally treated like commodities. It is estimated that thousands of boys travel every year to try their luck in European clubs, but a huge number can get a professional contract and end up living in vulnerable situations. And the saddest part is, at the same time this happens, the big clubs and federations sell the narrative that soccer is a space of social rights and opportunities. Of course, that happens in some cases, but the human and social cost of the industry is huge.
In a sense, it seems like a continuation of colonialism. Central culture suck up talent for the global south, enrich the clubs and leagues, while the former colonies are left without sport infrastructure and unable to retain their younger talent.
Exactly. This is why many coaches, players trafficking isn't just a metaphor. It really has an exploratory character of lack of regulation that reproduces historical inequalities. The player who can shine, like Drogba or Mané, becomes a symbol of resistance and pride, but the hundreds of histories of many others are never told. And here we close the circle from classic colonialism, where territories and riches were exploited, we reached sport neocolonialism, where bodies and dreams are marketed. The question remains, until when does today global football really represent emancipation, and to what extent is the same colonial logic of exploitation and inequality? If we look broadly, colonialism helped shape the international system and even spread football, but post-colonialism reminds us that this kind of spaces not only are of domination, they also are of resistance. Football can be seen at the same time as an instrument of neocolonialism with the talent exploitation and global inequality, and as a space of emancipation when national teams and players challenge Eurocentric narratives.
Well, we have reached the end of another episode of Entre Redes RE. Today we discussed colonialism, post-colonialism, and soccer, showing how global story and international relations theory are reflect on the field. I would like to thank my guest Havilla for participating and for her incredible insights.
Thank you for the invitation, Alessandra. Today's topic was something I studied for a long time, as in the graduation and in the master's degree. It was very interesting for me to say something different, but that is a part of our lives, like soccer. So you can also follow me on Instagram. It's Prof. Avila, with an H and double L. So don't forget to follow Entre Redes here on Spotify and to turn on the notifications. And our Instagram is entre.redesre. So you already know. Between the nets of soccer and the threads of international politics, we meet here because, in the end, the ball also carries power. So, until the next episode of Entre Redes mais RI.